Jerry Lewis was in the middle of his famous telethon, surrounded by celebrities and cameras, when Frank Sinatra whispered something in his ear that made him freeze in terror. The next moment would either heal a 20-year wound or humiliate Jerry Lewis in front of 50 million people. He had no idea what Frank had planned. It was September 5th, 1976, Labor Day weekend, and Jerry Lewis was doing what he'd done every year since 1966, hosting his marathon telethon to raise money for children with muscular dystrophy. The cameras were rolling live across America, donations were pouring in, and Jerry was in his element, working the crowd of celebrities who'd come to support the cause. But what the 50 million viewers watching at home didn't know was that Jerry Lewis was about to experience the most emotional moment of his life, orchestrated by Frank Sinatra and involving the one person Jerry had refused to see, speak to, or even acknowledge for exactly 20 years and 42 days. That person was Dean Martin, once his best friend, his comedy partner, and the other half of the most successful entertainment duo in history. Now, they were Hollywood's most famous enemies. Two men who had loved each other like brothers and then destroyed each other so completely that their very names couldn't be mentioned in the same sentence. To understand the magnitude of what was about to happen on live television, you have to understand how deep their friendship once was and how devastating their breakup had been. Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis first met in 1945 at the Glass Hat Club in New York City. Dean was a struggling nightclub singer with a smooth voice and an easy charm. Jerry was a 19-year-old comedian who could make people laugh just by walking on stage. They were both trying to make it in show business, both fighting for every opportunity, both dreaming of something bigger. Their first performance together was almost an accident. They were both working at the same club in Atlantic City, and one night they started fooling around during each other's acts. Dean would be singing a romantic ballad, and Jerry would interrupt with some crazy physical comedy. The audience ate it up. Within a year, Martin and Lewis had become the hottest act in America. Dean was the handsome, straight man with the golden voice, and Jerry was the lovable goofball who could make Dean break character with his antics. They were making $75,000 a week in Las Vegas, when the average American was making $3,000 a year. But more than the money, more than the fame, they genuinely loved each other. Dean called Jerry partner. Jerry called Dean pally. They were inseparable. They lived near each other. Their families vacationed together. Their children played together. In an industry full of fake friendships, theirs was real. Jerry later said, "Dean wasn't just my partner. He was the brother I never had. I would have done anything for him, and I thought he felt the same way about me." For 10 years, they were on top of the world. They had their own radio show. They were regulars on television, and they made 16 movies together for Paramount. Every movie was a hit. Every appearance was sold out. They were so popular that when they walked down the street together, traffic would literally stop. But success can be a poison, especially when two people have very different ideas about what success should look like. By the mid-1950s, cracks were starting to show. Dean wanted to be taken seriously as a singer and actor. He was tired of being seen as just the straight man in a comedy act. Jerry, on the other hand, wanted to expand their comedy, maybe get into filmmaking and directing. He had grand visions for what Martin and Lewis could become.
The problem was that they stopped talking to each other about these dreams. They stopped communicating about what they wanted, and instead they started talking through agents, managers, and lawyers. The brotherhood that had made them great was being slowly poisoned by business. Jerry began taking more control of their films, writing and directing their later movies. Dean felt like he was being pushed aside, reduced to a supporting player in his own career. Meanwhile, Jerry felt like Dean was becoming distant and uninterested, going through the motions without the passion that it made them special. The tension reached a breaking point during the filming of their final movie, Hollywood or Bust, in 1956. According to people who were there, Dean and Jerry barely spoke to each other, except when the cameras were rolling. They would arrive at the studio separately, work their scenes, and leave without saying goodbye. The end came on July 25, 1956, exactly 10 years to the day after their first performance together. They were finishing their run at the Copacabana nightclub in New York City. It was their farewell performance, though the audience didn't know it yet. After their final bow, they walked off stage together for the last time. According to Jerry, Dean looked at him and said, "Well, that's it. It's been great, Pally." And then Dean Martin walked out of Jerry Lewis's life forever. Jerry was devastated. He later said it was like losing a brother to death, except worse because Dean was still alive. He just didn't want anything to do with Jerry anymore. The breakup made international headlines. Fans couldn't believe that Martin and Lewis were finished. The press tried to figure out what had happened, but both men refused to talk about it in detail. Dean simply said, "The act ran its course." Jerry was more emotional, telling reporters that he still loved Dean like a brother and hoped they could work things out. But Dean had made his decision. He wanted to move on with his life, and for him, that meant completely cutting ties with his past. When reporters asked him about Jerry, he would say, "Jerry who?" When someone mentioned their 10 years together, Dean would act like it had never happened. For Jerry, this was the cruelest part. He could have handled anger, he could have handled a fight, but he couldn't handle being erased. It was as if Dean had decided that their entire friendship, all those years of laughter and success and brotherhood, had meant nothing. The two men went in completely different directions. Dean became a solo singing star, joined the Rat Pack with Frank Sinatra, and reinvented himself as the ultimate cool guy. Jerry threw himself into his solo career, becoming a filmmaker and eventually the host of the Muscular Dystrophy Telethon. But for 20 years, they never spoke. They never saw each other. They moved in the same Hollywood circles, but they made sure their paths never crossed. When they were both invited to the same parties, one of them would decline. When they were both offered roles in the same movie, one would pass. Their friends tried to broker peace. Frank Sinatra, who was close to both men, attempted several times to get them to reconcile. But Dean would always shut it down. "That's in the past, Frank. I don't look backwards." Jerry, on the other hand, never gave up hope. In interviews, he would always speak fondly of Dean even after years of silence. He would say things like, "I still love Dean Martin. I always will. If he called me tomorrow and needed help, I'd be there." But the call never came. By 1976, both men were in their 50s. Dean was still a major star, but he was also drinking heavily and seemed increasingly isolated. Jerry had found his calling with the telethon, raising millions for charity, but those who knew him said he still carried the wound of losing Dean.
Frank Sinatra had been watching this feud for 20 years, and he'd had enough. He loved both men, and he was tired of seeing them waste their lives on this stubborn silence. So he hatched a plan. Frank knew that Jerry's telethon was broadcast live, with no script and no rehearsal. Anything could happen, and often did. It was the perfect setting for a surprise that couldn't be planned around or avoided. On the night of September 5th, Frank came to the telethon as he did every year. Jerry was thrilled to see him, as always. But what Jerry didn't know was that Frank had made a secret phone call earlier that day. "Dean," Frank had said, "it's been 20 years. This is ridiculous. I'm going to the telethon tonight, and you're coming with me." Dean had protested. "Frank, I told you, I'm not interested in—" "I'm not asking you, Dino. I'm telling you, we're ending this tonight." Now, as Jerry worked the crowd of celebrities, Frank made his move. He walked up to Jerry with a big smile and put his arm around him. "How you doing, Jerry?" "Great, Frank. Thanks for being here." "Jerry," Frank said, his voice taking on a serious tone, "I have a surprise for you." Jerry laughed. A surprise? What kind of surprise? Frank leaned in close and whispered in Jerry's ear, "Your partner is here." Jerry's smile vanished. His face went white. For a moment, he looked like he might faint. "What?" Jerry whispered back. "Dean's here. He wants to see you." Jerry stared at Frank in disbelief. The cameras were still rolling. The audience was watching. Donations were coming in. But suddenly, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was that somewhere in this building was Dean Martin, the man Jerry had missed every day for 20 years. "Where?" Jerry asked, his voice barely audible. Frank smiled. "Turn around." Jerry turned around, and there, walking slowly across the stage, was Dean Martin. He was wearing a tuxedo, looking as cool and composed as ever, but there was something in his eyes that Jerry had never seen before. Vulnerability, maybe even fear. The audience erupted. They had no idea what they were witnessing. This was improvised, unrehearsed, completely real. 50 million people across America were watching two former best friends see each other for the first time in 20 years. Jerry stood frozen for what seemed like an eternity. Then slowly, Dean walked up to him and said the words that broke a 2-decade silence. "So," Dean said with that famous Martin smile, "so you're working?" It was such a perfectly Dean Martin thing to say, cool, casual, funny, that Jerry burst out laughing through his tears. "You son of a bitch!" And then they fell into each other's arms. The audience went crazy. Celebrities backstage were crying. Phone operators handling donations said the phones lit up like never before as people called in just to be part of this moment. Dean and Jerry stood there hugging for what felt like forever, 20 years of hurt and stubbornness and pride, melting away in front of the whole world. "I missed you, Pally," Jerry whispered. "I missed you too, partner," Dean whispered back. Frank Sinatra stood nearby, tears streaming down his face, watching two of his dearest friends finally find their way back to each other. They talked for a few minutes on stage, mostly just looking at each other in amazement. Dean joked that he was appearing at the MGM Grand, deliberately mispronouncing it as the Meggum in his slightly drunk persona. Jerry laughed like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. Then Dean had to leave. He had a show to do, and this moment had already lasted longer than anyone expected. But as he walked off stage, he turned back and gave Jerry a little wave. It would be their last public appearance together, but it was enough. The wound that had festered for 20 years had finally been healed. Jerry later said it was one of the 3 most important moments of his life. Dean never spoke publicly about it, but friends said he seemed lighter afterward, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. They never performed together again. They never became best friends again, but they kept in quiet touch for the rest of their lives. When Dean's son died in 1987, Jerry was one of the first people to call. When Jerry had health problems, Dean would check in through mutual friends. The telethon that night raised more money than any previous year. People said it was because America had just witnessed something magical, the power of forgiveness, live and unscripted in front of the whole world. Dean Martin died in 1995. Jerry Lewis spoke at his memorial service, and his words were simple but perfect. "Dean was my partner, and partners don't really say goodbye. We just say, 'See you later, Pally.'" Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about romance. Sometimes they're about friendship, about two people who found each other, lost each other, and with a little help from a friend, found their way back to forgiveness. The 20-year silence between Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis reminds us that it's never too late to heal old wounds, and that some friendships are so powerful they can survive even our worst mistakes. The telethon that night raised more money than any previous year. People said it was because America had just witnessed something magical, the power of forgiveness, live and unscripted in front of the whole world.